Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashern Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I was in 4th grade when something happened that I still can't fully explain, even years later. It was an ordinary evening. My parents had gone out for a walk around the neighborhood, leaving me home alone for a little while. At that age, I actually enjoyed having the house to myself. It felt like a small taste of independence, and since I was generally a responsible kid, my parents trusted me to be alone for short periods of time. That evening had been completely normal up to that point. I had already finished all of my homework, packed my school bag for the next day, and placed it neatly on the dining room table. I liked being prepared. Knowing everything was ready for school meant I could relax for the rest of the evening without worrying about anything. After setting my bag on the table, I headed to my bedroom. I climbed onto my bed and settled in, planning to read for a while and enjoy the quiet. The house was completely still. No television, no music, no voices, just the faint sounds that every house makes when nobody is paying attention to them. A few minutes later, I heard a loud thump from the other room. The sound startled me. I sat up and looked toward my bedroom door. For a moment, I wasn't sure what I had heard. It sounded like something had fallen. Curious, I got off the bed and walked into the dining room. My school bag was lying on the floor. I stared at it for a second. That's strange, I thought. The table wasn't particularly small, but I figured I must have placed the bag too close to the edge without realizing it. Maybe it had been unbalanced. Maybe one of the straps had shifted and slowly pulled it over. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable explanation. I picked up the bag, set it back on the table, and made sure it looked stable. Then I returned to my room. A few minutes later, just as I was beginning to relax again, I heard another thump. The exact same sound. This time I immediately knew what it was. I jumped off the bed and hurried back to the dining room. The bag was on the floor again. Now, I was annoyed. I couldn't understand how it had fallen twice. I picked it up and examined it more carefully. The bag wasn't particularly heavy. Nothing seemed unusual about it. The table wasn't shaky. There wasn't a fan blowing nearby. There was no obvious reason for it to keep falling. Determined to solve the problem once and for all, I decided to make absolutely certain it couldn't happen again. I carried the bag back to the table and pushed it as far back as possible until it was touching the wall. Then I adjusted it carefully. I wedged it into position so securely that it seemed impossible for it to fall forward. I even gave the table a slight shake to test it. The bag didn't move. Satisfied, I stepped back. There, I thought. No way that's falling now. Feeling confident that the mystery had been solved, I headed back to my room. But before lying down, something made me glance back toward the dining room. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was irritation, or maybe some part of me wanted proof that I had finally fixed the problem. Whatever the reason, I sat on the edge of my bed and kept looking toward the table. At first, nothing happened. The bag remained exactly where I had placed it. The house was silent. Everything seemed normal. Then, I noticed something. The bag moved. Not much, just a tiny shift, so small that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I blinked. The bag moved again. This time there was no doubt. I felt my stomach tighten. I remained completely still, staring at it. The bag slowly began sliding forward across the table, not falling, not tipping because of gravity, sliding, as if an invisible hand were pushing it. I remember feeling completely frozen. My eyes were locked on it. I couldn't look away. Every logical explanation I could think of disappeared. There was no breeze, no vibration. No one else was in the house. And yet the bag continued moving, slowly, deliberately, inch by inch. The movement wasn't sudden or jerky. That somehow made it even worse. If it had simply fallen, I could have blamed physics. But this looked intentional. The bag crept closer and closer to the edge of the table. I could feel my heartbeat getting faster. I wanted to move. I wanted to walk over and stop it. But I couldn't. Fear had rooted me to the spot. The room suddenly felt colder. The silence felt heavier. I watched as the bag reached the edge. Then it began to tilt forward, very slowly. Almost teasingly. The bottom of the bag remained on the table, while the top leaned farther and farther outward. It looked exactly as though something unseen was standing behind it and pushing. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was wrong. I remember gripping the edge of my bed so tightly that my hands hurt. The bag was seconds away from falling. I was completely mesmerized. Then the doorbell rang. The sound exploded through the silence. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart lurched into my throat. The sudden noise felt impossibly loud after the stillness of the house. For a split second, my attention shifted toward the front door. My parents were home. Relief washed over me instantly. But before I could even stand up, something happened that I still remember with absolute clarity. The bag snapped back upright. Not gradually, not slowly. Instantly, one moment it was leaning over the edge. The next moment it was standing perfectly straight, as though nothing had happened. As though it had never moved at all. I sat there staring. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. The doorbell rang again. My parents were waiting outside, but I remained frozen for another few seconds, unable to process what I had seen. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and answer the door. My parents walked inside, chatting casually about their walk. Everything felt normal again. Too normal. The house looked exactly the same as it always did. The dining room looked ordinary. The table looked ordinary. The bag sat exactly where I had left it, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened while I was alone. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't understand. I considered telling my parents. Several times I almost did. But every time I thought about describing what I had seen, the words sounded ridiculous. How was I supposed to explain that my school bag had apparently moved on its own? How could I describe the way it had slid across the table, or the way it had stood back upright the instant the doorbell rang? Even as a child, I knew how unbelievable it sounded. So I kept quiet. I never told anyone. Not that night, not the next day, not for a very long time. Instead, I tried to convince myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe I had imagined part of it. Maybe I had been tired. Maybe there was something about the table that I didn't understand. But no explanation ever felt right. The memory stayed with me. Years passed. I grew older. I experienced countless ordinary days and forgot thousands of insignificant moments from childhood. Yet somehow, that evening remained crystal clear. I can still picture the dining room. I can still hear the thump of the bag hitting the floor. I can still see it inching toward the edge of the table while I watched in disbelief. And I can still remember the exact moment the doorbell rang and the bag snapped back upright. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I was there, I saw it with my own eyes, and even now, years later, thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. Of all the strange things I've experienced in my life, that quiet evening when I was home alone in 4th grade remains one of the few memories that I still can't explain. And to this day, it still creeps me out. 2. When I was 18 years old, I was attending college in Miami and spending a lot of my free time volunteering through a church group. We worked on different community projects around the city, and one summer we organized a program for local children in a park located in Overtown. At that time, Overtown had a reputation for being one of the roughest neighborhoods in Miami. Crime was common, and many people from outside the area avoided it altogether. Still, our group believed the kids deserved positive activities and safe places to spend their summer days, so every week we showed up to run games, hand out snacks, and spend time with them. Most of us were young college students who probably didn't fully understand how different life was for many of the families living there. We were idealistic and eager to help, and for the most part, the community welcomed us. One afternoon, while I was walking through the neighborhood, an older black woman sitting on her front porch called out to me. She had been watching our group work with the children and seemed genuinely appreciative of what we were doing. She smiled and said, "It's nice what you white boys are doing for the babies." Then her expression changed slightly, and she added, "But you better make sure my grandsons don't come around. They'll shoot you." The warning was so blunt and unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. Before I could say anything, she burst into laughter. She laughed and laughed as if she had just told the funniest joke in the world. I remember laughing awkwardly along with her, not entirely sure whether she was joking, being serious, or somehow both at the same time. Looking back, it was probably a little of each. A few days later, I had an experience that made her words seem much less funny. One afternoon, I was walking alone a couple of blocks away from the park where our program was being held. I was heading toward another part of the neighborhood and wasn't paying much attention to anything around me. It was a hot Miami day, and my mind was focused on completely ordinary things. As I turned a corner, everything changed in an instant. I nearly collided with a man standing just around the bend. The encounter surprised both of us. What caught my attention immediately was the large plastic bag he was carrying. Inside it were dozens of smaller plastic bags, filled with a white powdery substance. Maybe it was baking powder. Maybe it wasn't. Given the time, the place, and the circumstances, I had a pretty good guess. The moment our eyes met, both of us reacted with shock. But then I realized there was another man nearby. The second man was just as startled as the first. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. Both men shouted at the same time. Almost instantly, they each pulled out pistols and pointed them directly at me. One second I had been walking down a neighborhood street. The next second I was staring down the barrels of two guns. Time seemed to slow down. I remember feeling completely frozen. My brain struggled to process what was happening. The whole situation felt unreal, as though I had accidentally stepped into the middle of someone else's story. The guns were pointed at me. The men looked terrified, and somehow that terrified me even more. They weren't acting like people preparing to rob someone. They were acting like people who thought they had just been caught. For a brief moment, all three of us simply stood there. Nobody moved. Nobody fired. Nobody seemed to know what to do next. Then instinct took over. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I decided to behave as though absolutely nothing unusual was happening. Instead of running, screaming, or raising my hands, I calmly said, "Pardon me." Those two words were the only thing I could think of. Then I carefully walked forward. I walked directly between the two armed men. I didn't run. I didn't hurry. I didn't make any sudden movements. Most importantly, I didn't look back. Every instinct in my body wanted me to sprint away as fast as possible, but I had a feeling that running might be the worst thing I could do. So I kept walking. One step, then another, then another. Behind me, I could hear both men yelling, To this day, I have no idea what they were saying. My mind was too focused on staying calm and getting away. Their words blended together into meaningless noise. I just kept moving forward and tried to act as if I hadn't seen anything at all. I didn't turn my head. I didn't make eye contact. I didn't acknowledge what had happened. I simply continued walking down the street. Then, as I got farther away, one sentence finally cut through the noise. One of the men shouted, "Fuck." That scared the shit out of me. Of all the things that happened that day, that line might be the part I remember most clearly, because it suddenly made me realize something. The men had been just as frightened as I was. Maybe more. I had accidentally appeared out of nowhere and startled them in the middle of whatever they were doing. Their reaction had been immediate panic. Only afterward did I think about one other detail that made the entire story even stranger. That day, I wasn't dressed like a normal college student. I was dressed as a clown. Not partially dressed. Not wearing a funny hat. I mean completely dressed as a clown. I had full clown makeup covering my face. I was wearing a brightly colored outfit. I had a long polka dot tie hanging down my chest. I had a clown wig. The whole costume. Everything. I had been working with the children's program and was still in character when I left the park. So when those two armed men turned the corner and suddenly encountered someone unexpectedly, they didn't see an ordinary person. They saw a full-sized clown appear out of nowhere. Looking back, I often wonder if that detail changed everything. Maybe seeing a clown instead of a potential threat confused them. Maybe it made the situation seem ridiculous enough to break the tension. Maybe it caused them to hesitate for just a second longer than they otherwise would have. Of course, I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that I walked away unharmed from a situation that could have ended very differently. Many years later, I can still picture the scene clearly. The hot Miami street, the corner, the plastic bags, the guns, the shouting. And standing right in the middle of it all was an 18-year-old college student dressed head to toe as a clown. As strange as it sounds, it's entirely possible that clown costume saved my life. When I was a teenager, I spent a lot of time doing the kind of things that teenagers do when they're bored and have nowhere else to be. My friends weren't always around, and back then I had a habit of wandering off by myself to explore places I probably had no business exploring. One afternoon, I found myself underneath a large bridge not far from where I lived. There wasn't any particular reason for me to be there. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was simply bored out of my mind and searching for something interesting to break up an otherwise uneventful day. The area beneath the bridge was exactly what you'd expect. It was quiet, isolated, and littered with large rocks and patches of dirt. The constant hum of distant traffic echoed overhead, while shadows stretched beneath the massive concrete structure. As I wandered around, I noticed a huge drainage pipe built into one side of the embankment. When I say huge, I mean huge. It wasn't one of those small pipes you could barely crawl through. This thing was large enough for a person to walk through without much trouble. The opening sat above a collection of massive stones that had been placed around the drainage area to control water flow. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to climb up and take a closer look. Getting there wasn't exactly easy. The rocks were uneven and loose in places, forcing me to carefully test my footing with every step. A couple of times I nearly slipped and had to catch myself. Eventually, I found a relatively stable spot near the mouth of the pipe. From where I stood, I could lean forward and look directly inside. At first, all I saw was darkness. The tunnel stretched away into the distance, disappearing into shadow. But there was also a faint glow coming from the far end. The pipe ran all the way through to the other side, and daylight was filtering in from the opposite opening. The dim light created a long silhouette effect inside the tunnel. I leaned forward a little farther to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. There was someone inside. A person, completely naked. They were crouched deep inside the pipe, almost perfectly still. The position they were sitting in reminded me immediately of something unnatural. Their knees were pulled up tightly, their arms were tucked close, their body seemed folded into itself in a way that looked deeply uncomfortable. The first comparison that flashed through my mind was Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. They had long, stringy hair hanging around their face. Their posture was strange, and they were staring directly at me, not glancing in my direction, not looking around, staring right at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was completely frozen. My heart seemed to stop. I remember feeling an immediate surge of confusion before the fear even arrived, because finding a naked person inside a giant drainage tunnel wasn't exactly something I had prepared myself for. The entire scene felt wrong. Every part of it, the silence, the location, the posture, the fact that they seemed to have been sitting there in complete darkness, just watching. The light from the opposite end of the pipe made it impossible to see every detail clearly, but it illuminated enough for me to make out the shape of their shoulders and the outline of their body. I could also see their eyes, the faint light reflected off them. That detail has stayed with me more than anything else. Those eyes. Watching, unblinking for several seconds, neither of us moved. I should have run immediately. Looking back, that's what most people probably would have done. But shock has a strange way of affecting you. Sometimes fear doesn't make you move. Sometimes it makes you stand completely still. That's exactly what happened to me. I just stared, and they stared back. Then everything changed. The figure began to move, slowly, very slowly. At first, I couldn't even tell what they were doing. The movement seemed unnatural. Their bodies shifted in a way that was difficult to process. They unfolded themselves. That's honestly the best way I can describe it. It was as if they had been compressed into that crouched position and were now slowly extending upward. Their limbs straightened, their shoulders rose, their head lifted. The entire motion felt disturbingly deliberate. The second I realized they were standing up, every survival instinct in my body activated at once. Whatever curiosity had brought me to that pipe disappeared instantly. I turned around and ran. Not jogged, not hurried. Ran, I practically launched myself off the rocks. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. The loose stones shifted beneath my feet as I scrambled upward. I slipped once and nearly lost my balance, but adrenaline kept me moving. The only thing I cared about was getting as far away from that drainage pipe as possible. I didn't look back. Not once. People always say they would turn around and check. I didn't. There was absolutely no part of me that wanted confirmation of what was happening behind me. I just kept climbing. As I scrambled over the rocks, I heard something. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed from inside the concrete tunnel. It was faint, but unmistakable. At the time, I interpreted it as footsteps. The sound of something moving against the concrete. The sound seemed to follow after the moment I had started running. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. I wasn't interested in finding out. I reached the top of the embankment and got out of there as fast as I could. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. My mind kept replaying the image over and over again. The crouched figure, the hair, the eyes, the way it had stood up. Most importantly, I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation. Eventually, I settled on the most logical possibility. It had to be a homeless person. That made sense, right? People sometimes shelter in unusual places. A drainage tunnel could provide cover from the weather. It was a reasonable explanation. For a long time, that's what I told myself. Whenever the memory surfaced, I'd immediately dismiss it. Just a homeless person. Problem solved. Except there was one detail that always bothered me. Actually, several details. There were no belongings anywhere. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no shopping cart, no blankets, no food containers, no trash, nothing. The area inside the tunnel was completely bare. Just smooth concrete. That's it. No signs whatsoever that someone had been living there. No evidence that anyone spent time there at all. Just that figure, sitting in the darkness, watching. Every time I remembered the scene, that detail made the explanation feel a little less convincing. Of course, I still believe it was probably a person. Logically, that's the answer that makes the most sense. But logic doesn't always erase the emotional impact of a memory. And emotionally, that encounter remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Even now, more than 6 years later, I can still picture the scene with incredible clarity. The bridge, the rocks, the giant concrete pipe, the dim light shining through from the opposite end, and that figure crouched in the darkness, staring directly at me. Maybe it was a homeless person. Maybe it was someone hiding for reasons I'll never understand. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation for everything I saw. But regardless of what it actually was, the feeling that washed over me in that moment was pure terror. And one thing is certain. In all the years since it happened, I have never gone back underneath that bridge. Not once. Some places are easier to leave behind than revisit. That bridge is one of them. 4. When I was growing up, my brother and I fought constantly. Not the occasional sibling argument that most brothers and sisters have. I mean actual physical fights. Looking back, it almost seemed normal at the time because it happened so often. We'd argue over something stupid, tempers would flare, and before long we'd be shoving, wrestling, or throwing punches. Most of the time, the fights ended the same way. One of us would storm off. We'd both have a few bruises, scratches, or sore muscles. Then, we'd eventually move on and act like nothing had happened. As kids, it became part of our relationship. But every now and then, something would happen that felt completely different. Every once in a while, my brother would reach a point where it seemed like something inside him snapped. The anger stopped looking normal. It stopped looking like a kid getting upset. It was as if he suddenly lost control of himself completely. His eyes would change. His face would change. And it felt like he wasn't really seeing the person standing in front of him anymore. It was like he became consumed by pure rage. Those moments terrified me. Not because I thought he wanted to hurt me during a fight, but because it felt like he stopped understanding how much harm he could actually do. The scariest example happened when we were younger and swimming together. It started as another ordinary argument. At least, that's how I remember it. I don't even remember what we were fighting about. The reason has been completely erased from my memory. What I remember is what happened afterward. We were in the pool. 1 second we were arguing. The next second things became physical. At first it felt like every other fight we'd ever had. Then I saw that look. The look that meant he had crossed that invisible line. The look that meant logic and reason were gone. His anger had completely taken over. Before I could react, he forced me underwater. At first I thought he was trying to scare me. Then I realized he wasn't letting go. I struggled. Nothing happened. I pushed, kicked, twisted, tried to pull away. But he kept holding me down. The longer it lasted, the more panic began to take over. The world became muffled beneath the water. I could hear the distorted sounds of splashing and movement around me. My lungs started burning. Every instinct in my body screamed for air. I remember the absolute terror of realizing I couldn't get to the surface. That realization changed everything. What had felt like a fight suddenly felt like something much worse. For the first time in my life, I genuinely thought I might die. People often say they saw their life flash before their eyes. I never understood that expression until that moment, because that's exactly what it felt like. A flood of memories, faces, moments, random pieces of my life. Everything seemed to hit me at once. Time felt strange, both incredibly fast and impossibly slow. I wasn't thinking about winning the fight anymore. I wasn't thinking about getting revenge. I wasn't even thinking about my brother. I was simply trying to survive. Eventually, somehow, I managed to break free. To this day, I don't remember exactly how. Whether he loosened his grip or I found enough strength to escape, I honestly don't know. I just remember suddenly reaching the surface. The feeling of air hitting my lungs felt almost painful. I gasped, coughed, choked, and pulled myself out of the pool as fast as I could. The moment I was safely out of the water, everything hit me at once. My body began shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't catch my breath. My chest felt tight. My heart was pounding. I was crying and gasping at the same time. At the time, I didn't know what a panic attack was. Now I do. That's exactly what it was. I sat there completely overwhelmed while my body tried to process what had just happened. My dad came over and immediately realized something was wrong. He calmed me down as best he could and started yelling at my brother. I remember hearing them arguing while I struggled to breathe normally again. But even back then, I had the feeling that my dad didn't fully understand what had happened. From his perspective, he probably saw two kids fighting and one of them taking things too far. He likely thought, "You could have killed your sister. You need to be more careful." What I felt was different. What I experienced felt different. Because from where I was standing, it wasn't that my brother almost killed me through carelessness. It felt like, for those few terrifying moments, he was actively trying to. That distinction stayed with me for years. As we got older, our relationship became complicated. Despite everything, we remained close throughout much of our childhood. That probably sounds strange to people from the outside, but family relationships often are. We still spent time together. We still shared memories. We still had moments where we genuinely got along. But we also continued fighting. Most of the time it was the same pattern it had always been. Arguments, shouting, occasional physical confrontations. Nothing that seemed completely out of the ordinary for us. Then every so often, that other side of him would appear. The side that scared me. The side that seemed incapable of controlling itself once the anger took over. As teenagers, things changed. We gradually stopped spending as much time together. We weren't as close anymore. The fighting between us largely disappeared. Part of that was simply growing up. Part of it was that we had developed separate lives and separate groups of friends. But while he stopped fighting with me, I noticed his anger hadn't really gone away. It had simply found different outlets. Whenever something upset him, his reactions often seemed extreme. He would punch holes in walls, break things, explode with anger over situations that didn't seem to justify that level of rage. Watching it from a distance was unsettling because it reminded me of those moments from childhood, the same uncontrollable anger, the same loss of control, the same feeling that once he crossed a certain line, nobody could reach him. Years later, after I graduated from college, I moved back home for a short period of time while figuring out my next steps. By then, we were both adults. The physical fights were long gone. At least, I thought they were. One night, we got into an argument. Nothing unusual at first. Just a disagreement that escalated. Then suddenly, he hit me. right in the face. For a moment, I couldn't believe it had happened. Not because it hurt physically, but because it instantly brought back years of memories. The pool, the fear, the rage, everything. In that moment, I realized something important. No matter how much time had passed, some wounds had never actually healed. After that incident, I made a decision. I moved out of my parents' house and into my own apartment. It wasn't only because of that argument, but it was certainly the moment that pushed me to finally leave. Over time, things changed again. Today, my brother is no longer violent. He doesn't get into physical fights. He doesn't seem to fall into those blind rages the way he once did. By all appearances, he has matured and gained control over that side of himself. For that, I'm genuinely grateful. But healing isn't always as simple as behavior changing, because while the violence stopped, something else never happened. He never apologized. He never acknowledged what he had done. He never took responsibility for the fear he caused or the damage left behind. There was never a conversation, never any accountability, never any recognition of how those experiences affected me. And because of that, our relationship never truly recovered. Today, we aren't enemies. We don't argue. We don't fight. But we aren't close either. We exist somewhere in between. I see him at family gatherings. I see him during holidays. We exchange polite conversations. We stand in the same rooms and participate in the same events. To most people, everything probably looks normal, but underneath that surface is a distance that never really went away. Some experiences change the way you see someone forever, even when the danger is gone, even when years have passed, even when they've become a different person. And no matter how much time goes by, I'll never forget the day I looked up from beneath the water and genuinely believed I might not make it back to the surface. 5. Reading stories about siblings suddenly losing control during a fight always brings back one memory that I haven't thought about in years. My older brother had that same switch. Most of the time, he was just a normal older brother. We argued, annoyed each other, and had the usual conflicts that come with growing up together. Looking back, there were plenty of good memories mixed in with the bad ones. But every now and then, something would happen that felt completely different. It was like he could reach a point where anger stopped being anger and became something else entirely. A point where reason disappeared. A point where nothing anyone said could get through to him. A point of no return. One of the clearest examples happened when I was very young. My brother was 4 years older than me, which felt like a huge age gap at the time. When you're 7 or 8 years old, someone 4 years older might as well be an adult. They're bigger, stronger, faster, and there's not much you can do if they decide to hurt you. I don't even remember exactly what started the situation. The details are mostly gone now. What I do remember is that we had both gotten into trouble for something and had been sent to our rooms. That part is still clear. We were separated and supposed to stay there. For most families, that would have been the end of it. But somehow, after we were sent away, something happened. Maybe I said something. Maybe I made a comment. Maybe I did something that irritated him further. I honestly don't know. Whatever it was, it pushed him over the edge. A short time later, he came into my room. I remember immediately sensing that something was wrong. Not just that he was angry. Angry was normal. This felt different. Before I could react, he was on me. 1 second I was sitting in my room. The next second he was on top of me, throwing punches. Not shoving. Not wrestling. Not the kind of roughhousing siblings sometimes get into. He was hitting me. Over and over. Most of the punches landed on my head. I remember the shock more than the pain. The sheer confusion of it. The feeling of suddenly being trapped beneath someone much bigger and stronger than you. At first, I think my brain expected it to stop. Like surely this would last a few seconds and then he'd calm down. But it didn't. The punches kept coming. I can still remember curling up and trying to protect myself. I wasn't fighting back. I wasn't trying to hit him. I wasn't even thinking about winning. I was just trying to cover my head. My arms were wrapped around my face while I waited for it to end. That's one of the details that sticks with me the most. People often imagine themselves fighting back in situations like that, standing up for themselves, defending themselves. But when you're a small child and someone much larger is attacking you, survival becomes your only concern. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about hurting him. I was thinking about protecting my head and making it stop. What scares me looking back isn't just the physical part. It's the feeling I remember seeing in him. There was something absent from his face, something disconnected. It felt like he wasn't really seeing me as his younger brother anymore. It felt like all he could see was his anger. As strange as it sounds, that was the frightening part, not the punches, the complete loss of control behind them. I remember lying there and having a very specific realization. I thought about yelling for my mom, I thought about calling for help, but almost immediately, another thought followed. There wasn't enough time. Even if I screamed, she wouldn't get there fast enough to witness what was happening. By the time she arrived, it would be over. And then, it would be my word against his. As a child, I had already learned something that felt unfair, but true. Adults didn't always see what happened. They only saw the aftermath. And when all they saw was the aftermath, they often assumed the truth was somewhere in the middle. Two kids fighting, two brothers arguing, two sides to every story. I remember believing that nobody would fully understand what had happened. So I didn't scream, I didn't call out, I just endured it and waited for it to end. Eventually, it did. Like all storms, it burned itself out. But the memory stayed. As I got older, I filed it away as one of those strange childhood experiences that you don't think about very often. Life moved on. Years passed. My brother and I grew up. We became adults. The intensity of childhood conflicts faded into memory. For a long time, I wondered if maybe I had exaggerated parts of what happened. Memory can be unreliable, especially when you're young. Maybe I was remembering it wrong. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt. Maybe childhood fear had distorted the experience. Those thoughts lingered in the back of my mind for years. Then something happened that completely changed the way I looked at those memories. A couple of years ago, I was having dinner with one of my oldest childhood friends and his father. It was one of those casual conversations where people start reminiscing about old times, stories from school, neighborhood memories, things we hadn't thought about in years. At one point, the conversation somehow turned toward my brother. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Then my friend's dad casually brought up the way my brother used to treat me when we were kids. The comment caught me completely off guard, because he remembered it, not just vaguely. Clearly, he talked about how my brother used to pick on me when we were younger, how it wasn't normal sibling teasing, how sometimes it seemed excessive, how sometimes it seemed cruel. I remember sitting there in silence for a moment, partly because I was surprised, partly because I realized something important. For years, I had treated those memories as private experiences that only existed inside my own head. But apparently, other people had noticed. Other adults had seen it. Other people had looked at our relationship and recognized that something wasn't right. That realization was strangely validating. Not because it changed what happened, not because it erased any of the memories, but because it confirmed something I had questioned for a long time. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't exaggerated it. I hadn't invented the fear I felt. Someone from the outside had seen enough to remember it decades later. That fact stayed with me long after the dinner ended. Today, when I look back on my childhood, I try to remember all of it. The good moments, the funny moments, the ordinary moments. But I also remember the difficult ones. And among those memories, one image still stands out more vividly than most. A small kid curled up on the floor of his bedroom, covering his head with his arms while his older brother raged above him. Not fighting back, not screaming, just waiting for it to stop. And even now, after all these years, that's still one of the most unsettling memories I carry from childhood. A lot of people answering questions like this talk about the scariest moment of their lives rather than the scariest thing they've ever actually seen. For me, both happened at the same time. I've spent a good portion of my life working in emergency services, and if there's one thing that comes with the job, it's learning how to stay calm when everyone else is panicking. You see things most people never see. You go places most people spend their entire lives hoping they never have to enter. Fire doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about experience. It doesn't care how prepared you think you are. Every call has the potential to become the one that doesn't end the way you expect. This story comes from the closest I've ever come to dying on the job. The call came in as a structure fire with a possible victim trapped inside. By the time we arrived, flames were already visible, and smoke was pouring from the building. Neighbors were gathered outside, shouting over each other and trying to tell us what they knew. Somewhere in the confusion, we received information that a woman was believed to still be inside. That changes everything. A fire becomes more than property protection when there's a life at stake. The objective becomes rescue. My partner and I geared up and prepared to make entry. Within moments, we were inside. The interior conditions were rough from the start. Visibility was nearly non-existent. Heat pressed against us from every direction. Smoke filled every available space. Even with years of training, stepping into a burning structure never feels natural. Every instinct tells you to go the other way. But training takes over. You focus on the job. You focus on the mission. You keep moving. As we searched, we heard something. A woman's voice. Faint at first. Then again. She was yelling for help. The sound echoed through the structure, distorted by walls, smoke, and the roar of the fire itself. But it was unmistakably a voice. A living person. That immediately intensified our search efforts. We knew she was somewhere inside. The problem was that we couldn't determine exactly where. Every time we thought we were getting closer, the sound seemed to come from somewhere else. The fire continued growing around us. The conditions deteriorated rapidly, much faster than anyone expected. Heat levels began rising dramatically. The smoke thickened. The building itself seemed to be changing around us. Then the order came over the radio. Evacuate. The incident commander had determined that conditions had become too dangerous. Nobody likes hearing that order when someone is still believed to be inside. But there are moments when staying means nobody survives. Reluctantly, we began making our way out. Somewhere during that process, things went wrong. I became disoriented. Even experienced firefighters can lose their bearings inside a structure fire. The environment becomes a maze of heat, darkness, noise, and confusion. One wrong turn, one blocked path, one moment of uncertainty. That's all it takes. At some point, I realized I had become separated from my partner. That realization sent a cold feeling through me, despite the extreme heat surrounding me. Being alone inside a burning building is never where you want to be. I began trying to reorient myself. Then part of the ceiling came down. The collapse happened fast. 1 second, everything was intact. The next second, debris was crashing around me. Fortunately, I wasn't pinned beneath it, but I wasn't free either. As I moved, I suddenly felt resistance. I couldn't understand what had happened at first. Then I realized I had become entangled. Wires from the damaged ceiling had wrapped themselves around my equipment. Specifically, they had become caught between the back of my helmet and the top of my CB. I tried moving. Nothing. I pulled again. Still stuck. The realization hit me immediately. I was trapped. Not permanently. Not completely. But trapped enough. The heat around me was becoming increasingly intense. Every second mattered. I began working methodically to free myself. Years of training kept panic at bay. I knew panic would only make things worse, so I focused on solving the problem. One movement at a time. One wire at a time. Then something happened that made the situation feel even worse. The woman's voice stopped. Up until that moment, I could still hear her yelling somewhere in the building. Suddenly, there was nothing. No cries, no calls for help, nothing. Just the sound of fire. The silence hit me harder than I expected. A terrible thought crossed my mind. Maybe we were too late. Maybe whatever chance she had was already gone. I remember feeling afraid. Not panicked, not overwhelmed, just afraid. The kind of fear that settles quietly into your chest. The kind that tells you how serious the situation really is. Then I saw something. At first I thought it was a trick of the smoke, a shifting shadow, a reflection, something caused by exhaustion and poor visibility, but it remained there, and then it moved. To this day, I struggle to explain exactly what I saw. The figure appeared human in shape, but it wasn't a person, at least not in any normal sense. It was entirely made of fire, not covered in flames, made of flames. There were no visible facial features, no eyes, no mouth, no identifiable clothing, no details that would allow me to recognize who or what it was. Just the unmistakable outline of a human figure composed entirely of fire. And it was carrying something. A body. The body of a woman. Even through the smoke and chaos, I could tell she had been severely burned. The figure held her in its arms and walked slowly through the flames, toward me. I remember staring at it in complete disbelief. For the first time during the entire incident, I felt genuine panic trying to claw its way into my mind. Not because I believed I was seeing a ghost, not because I believed anything supernatural was happening, but because what I was looking at seemed impossible. Every part of my brain was trying to make sense of it, trying to find a logical explanation, trying to understand what my eyes were seeing. Yet the image remained. The figure continued moving, step by step, walking through the fire, carrying the woman, coming directly toward me. I don't know how long I looked at it. It might have been seconds, it might have been less. Time behaves strangely when you're under extreme stress. What I do know is that I forced myself to focus. Whatever I had seen, I couldn't afford to freeze. I couldn't afford to panic. I had one job: get free, get out. Somehow, I managed to untangle myself from the wires. Even now, I couldn't tell you exactly how. Adrenaline took over. Determination took over. Survival took over. One moment I was trapped. The next I was moving. I made my way out of the structure and eventually emerged from the building. The fresh air hit me like a wave. Only then did I fully realize how close things had come. I suffered burns, but they were relatively minor considering the circumstances. Painful, yes, serious enough to be treated, absolutely, but not severe enough to keep me off duty. My turnout gear survived as well. The damage could have been much worse, far worse. My partner made it out safely too. Eventually, crews conducted overhaul operations once the fire was under control. During that process, they discovered the body of a woman inside the structure. The victim we had heard calling for help. The victim we had been trying to reach. The victim we never managed to save. I never told my crew what I saw that day. What would have been the point? Nobody would have believed me. Truthfully, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. I've spent years trying to rationalize the experience. Extreme heat, smoke, exhaustion, stress, low visibility, a brain trying desperately to process overwhelming information. All of those things can affect perception. Maybe what I saw was an illusion created by a combination of those factors. Maybe my mind constructed something out of shadows and flame. Maybe the image never existed outside my imagination. That's the explanation I usually settle on. It's the explanation that makes the most sense. And yet, even after all these years, I can still see it. The burning structure, the crushing heat, the silence after the woman's cries stopped, and emerging through the flames, a figure made entirely of fire carrying a charred woman in its arms. I've witnessed tragedy. I've witnessed death. I've witnessed things most people would consider horrifying. But nothing I have ever seen before or since has stayed with me the way that image has. Whether it was real or not, it remains the single most terrifying thing I have ever seen, and the memory of it still follows me every time I think about how close I came to never walking out of that building. When I was 14 years old, my family took a trip to Las Vegas. At the time, it felt like the kind of vacation every teenager would be excited about. Even though I was too young for casinos and nightlife, there was still plenty to see. The city felt larger than life. Everywhere you looked there were bright lights, massive hotels, giant advertisements, and crowds of people moving in every direction. The first couple of days were completely normal. We spent our time exploring different hotels, walking the strip, eating out, and doing all the typical tourist activities. Nothing strange happened, and I was having a great time. Then, on the third day, something changed. At first, it was subtle. I began noticing shadows. Not ordinary shadows. The kind of shadows that make you think someone is standing nearby. The kind that catch your attention just long enough to make you turn your head. Every time I thought I saw one, I'd glance in that direction. And every single time, there would be nothing there. At first, I ignored it. I assumed I was tired. Las Vegas can be exhausting. You're constantly walking, constantly surrounded by flashing lights, crowds, noise, and stimulation. I figured my eyes were simply playing tricks on me. But as the day went on, it kept happening. Again, and again, and again. I'd see movement out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape. A figure. A silhouette. Then I'd turn. Nothing. The strange part wasn't that I occasionally thought I saw something. The strange part was how often it happened. By the end of the day, I was becoming genuinely unsettled. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to sound ridiculous. How do you explain that you keep seeing things that disappear the moment you look directly at them? So I kept it to myself. That evening, we returned to our hotel. I remember feeling exhausted. I just wanted to get some sleep and put the weird day behind me. My sister and I were sharing a bed in our hotel room. The room itself was fairly standard, except for one feature that stood out. One wall was almost entirely made of glass. A massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooked the city. During the day, the view was incredible. At night, however, it felt different. The darkness beyond the glass created an eerie atmosphere that I couldn't quite explain. The lights of Las Vegas stretched endlessly into the distance, but beyond them was darkness. A darkness that somehow made the room feel exposed. Eventually, my sister fell asleep. I was still awake, lying there, looking around the room, trying to relax. That's when I saw someone standing in front of the window. My entire body froze. There was a figure standing near the glass, perfectly still. Watching, for a split second, I was absolutely convinced someone was in our room. My heart jumped into my throat. I immediately turned my head to look directly at it, and it vanished, just like all the other shadows. Nothing was there. The space in front of the window was completely empty. I sat there staring for several seconds, my pulse racing, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. I told myself I was tired. That was the explanation. It had to be. But deep down, I didn't fully believe it. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every small sound seemed louder. Every shadow seemed darker. Every movement in the room caught my attention. At some point, I found myself staring toward the foot of the bed, and that's when I saw her. To this day, it's the image that I remember most clearly. There was a girl peering over the edge of the bed. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Only the upper part of her face was visible. Her eyes, just her eyes. They looked enormous, far larger than they should have been. Dark, unmoving, locked directly onto me. I stared at her, waiting for her to disappear. Because that's what had happened every other time. Every shadow vanished the moment I focused on it. This time was different. She didn't disappear. She stayed exactly where she was, watching, completely motionless. I blinked. She was still there. I looked away and back again. Still there. The realization hit me like a wave of ice water. Whatever my brain had been telling me all day suddenly stopped working. I couldn't convince myself it was a trick of the light. I couldn't convince myself I was imagining it. At least not in that moment. All I knew was that there appeared to be a girl staring at me from the foot of my bed. And she wasn't going away. I completely lost it. I started screaming, crying, trying to back away even though there was nowhere to go. The fear was overwhelming. My sister woke up instantly. She sat up in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. I attempted to explain, but I could barely speak. My words came out in broken fragments. I kept pointing, trying to tell her what I was seeing, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. The panic was so intense that it quickly spread to her. Before long, she was terrified too. Whether she was reacting to my fear or genuinely seeing something herself, I don't know. All I remember is that both of us ended up completely frightened. Eventually, the night passed. Somehow, neither of us slept much. The next morning, I was emotionally drained. I hadn't planned on telling anyone what happened. I assumed nobody would believe me. Then my mom shared something strange, something that made the entire experience even more unsettling. She told me that my dad had experienced something unusual during the night. At some point, while everyone was asleep, he suddenly woke up screaming, not groaning, not talking in his sleep, actually screaming. My mom said he was terrified, begging her not to hurt him, completely panicked. At first, she couldn't understand what was happening. The episode reportedly lasted nearly an hour, an entire hour of fear and confusion. What made it even stranger was that this wasn't normal behavior for him. My dad almost never woke up during the night. He certainly didn't suffer from night terrors. Nothing like that had ever happened before. When he finally calmed down enough to explain what had happened, his story sounded like something from a horror movie. He said he had experienced an incredibly vivid dream. In the dream, my mom was cutting off his fingers. Not threatening to, actually doing it. The dream felt so real that when he woke up, he was convinced it had happened. Even more disturbing, he claimed he could physically feel the pain, the sensation of a missing finger, the agony of the injury, even after waking up. Hearing that story sent chills through me, because while my experience and his experience were completely different, they had happened during the same night. The same night I spent seeing shadows. The same night I saw the figure at the window. The same night, I saw the girl staring over the edge of the bed. For the rest of our trip, I remained on edge. Every shadow caught my attention. Every dark corner made me uncomfortable. I kept expecting something else to happen, but nothing ever reached the intensity of that night. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The week ended. We left Las Vegas, and the shadows disappeared. Completely. No more figures in the corners of rooms. No more movement in my peripheral vision. No more strange sightings. Nothing. Life returned to normal. What makes the experience so unsettling to me isn't necessarily the idea that it was paranormal. In fact, I've never considered myself someone who believes in ghosts. I've never been interested in supernatural stories. I've never had any other experiences that I'd describe as paranormal. Before that trip, nothing like it had ever happened. And since that trip, nothing like it has happened again. That's part of what makes it so difficult to explain. If it had happened regularly, I'd have an answer. If I believed in ghosts, I'd have an explanation. But I don't. And I didn't. All I have is a week-long experience that completely defied anything I'd ever experienced before or since. Even now, years later, I can still see that hotel room when I think about it. The giant window overlooking the city. The darkness outside. The figure standing near the glass. And most of all, the girl at the end of the bed. The girl whose enormous eyes stared directly at me. The one who didn't disappear when I looked. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe exhaustion, stress, strange lighting, and an overactive imagination combined to create something that felt real. That's probably the most reasonable answer. But regardless of what actually happened, that week in Las Vegas remains one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. And even now, thinking about it still gives me chills. One of the strangest stories in my family started with something my dad saw in the middle of the night. It happened years ago when my parents were living in the house where my sister and I grew up. By all accounts, it was an ordinary night. Nothing unusual had happened during the day, and everyone had gone to bed at their normal time. Sometime during the night, my dad woke up. At first, he wasn't even sure why. The house was quiet. The room was dark except for the faint light filtering in from the hallway. Like most people who wake up unexpectedly in the middle of the night, he spent a few moments trying to gather his thoughts and figure out what had disturbed his sleep. Then, he noticed someone standing in the hallway. At first glance, it looked like a woman. She was standing just outside the bedroom, perfectly still. According to my dad, she was wearing a blue dress. She had long blonde hair. In fact, from a distance, she looked remarkably similar to my mother. For a split second, he was simply confused. Why would my mom be standing in the hallway in the middle of the night? The thought barely had time to form before he instinctively turned his head toward the bed beside him. My mother was right there, fast asleep, exactly where she should have been. My dad immediately looked back toward the hallway. The woman was still there, standing motionless. Watching, he later said that what frightened him wasn't necessarily that the figure seemed threatening. In fact, he never described it as aggressive or menacing. There was no sense that it wanted to hurt anyone. No threatening movements, no frightening facial expression, nothing like that. And somehow, that made it even stranger, because there was no obvious explanation for why she was there. The figure simply existed. Silent, still, impossible, my dad stared for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, trying to convince himself he was still dreaming, trying to come up with any rational explanation. Then, just as suddenly as he had noticed her, the moment ended. Whether the figure disappeared, faded away, or whether he eventually fell back asleep, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the experience deeply unsettled him. It wasn't something he forgot. It wasn't one of those strange dreams that fades by morning. The image stayed with him. Years passed. Life moved on. The story became one of those odd family memories that occasionally came up in conversation. Most people assumed there had to be a simple explanation. A dream, sleep paralysis, a trick of the light, something along those lines. Even my dad never claimed he knew what happened. He only knew what he believed he had seen. Eventually, the incident became little more than an unusual story. Then, something happened that made the whole thing much harder to dismiss. A few years later, my parents went on vacation and left my sister in the care of my grandparents. My grandparents stayed at the house while my parents were away. Now, if there's one thing everyone in my family agreed on, it was this. My grandmother was not the type of person who believed in ghosts. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't superstitious. She wasn't interested in paranormal stories. She was probably the most practical person I've ever known. She approached everything logically. Everything had an explanation. Everything had a reason. If anyone in the family was least likely to report seeing something strange, it was her. That's why what happened next shocked everyone. After my parents returned home from their trip, my grandmother casually mentioned something unusual. She didn't make a big deal out of it. She didn't seem frightened. In fact, she sounded more confused than anything. At some point during the conversation, she said something like, "I saw the strangest thing during the night." Maybe it was a dream. Naturally, everyone asked what she meant. My grandmother paused for a moment before describing what she had seen. She said she thought she had seen a woman wearing a blue dress, running down the hallway. The room reportedly went silent. My parents immediately stared at each other, because she had never heard my father's story. Not from him, not from my mother, not from anyone. As far as she knew, she was simply describing a strange experience she couldn't explain. Yet, her description matched what my father had reported years earlier. A woman, a blue dress, in the hallway. My dad was stunned. My mom was equally shocked. Neither of them knew what to say. Of all the details my grandmother could have described, she somehow mentioned the exact ones that mattered. The same hallway, the same blue dress, the same female figure. And perhaps most importantly, she arrived at that description completely independently. No one had planted the idea in her head. No one had suggested it. No one had told her what my dad claimed to have seen. For years afterward, the story became one of the most discussed mysteries in our family. Every time it came up, someone would try to find a logical explanation. Maybe my dad had been dreaming. Maybe my grandmother had been dreaming too. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the human brain simply works in strange ways. All of those explanations are possible. In fact, they're probably the most reasonable explanations. But what made the story so difficult to forget wasn't necessarily the possibility of something supernatural. It was the coincidence itself. The fact that two completely different people, years apart, described nearly the same thing. And one of those people happened to be the least likely person imaginable to invent such a story. To this day, nobody in my family claims to know what actually happened. There was never another sighting, no dramatic paranormal activity, no mysterious messages, no haunted house events. Just two strange experiences separated by several years. Yet somehow, those experiences left a lasting impression on everyone who heard them. Even now, whenever the story comes up at family gatherings, the reaction is always the same. People pause, they exchange looks, and someone inevitably says the exact same thing. That is way too specific to be a coincidence. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe both encounters were simply vivid dreams occurring under similar circumstances. Or maybe there is another explanation that nobody has figured out yet. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. The image of a woman in a blue dress standing, or running, through that hallway has become one of the most enduring mysteries our family has ever experienced. And even decades later, nobody has managed to explain it. In 2017, my father was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. Even now, years later, those words are difficult to say. Cancer has a way of changing everything almost overnight. One day you're thinking about ordinary things, work, family, weekend plans, and the next you're living from appointment to appointment, trying to process news that feels impossible to accept. For our family, the diagnosis was devastating. My father had always been a strong presence in our lives. He wasn't the kind of person who sat still for very long. He was active, hardworking, and always seemed to have an answer whenever anyone needed advice. Watching someone like that become seriously ill is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. After his diagnosis, he spent about a month in the hospital. That month felt endless. Every day seemed to blur into the next. There were doctor visits, medical updates, conversations about treatments, and countless hours spent trying to stay hopeful while quietly preparing for possibilities nobody wanted to face. The emotional weight of it all was exhausting. One night during that period, something happened that I still struggle to explain. It was late, very late, around 1:30 in the morning. My mother, my girlfriend, and I were sitting around the dinner table. None of us were really doing much. We were simply talking, passing the time, and trying to distract ourselves from the reality of what our family was going through. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in the middle of the night. Outside, everything was still. Inside, the conversation drifted from one topic to another. Then, without warning, something caught my attention. I looked toward the doorway, and I saw my father. To this day, I can remember the exact moment. There was no gradual appearance, no strange noise, no dramatic buildup. One moment the doorway was empty, the next moment he was there, walking through it. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but the image didn't disappear, it remained. And the longer I looked, the more detail I noticed. I could clearly see his face. I recognized the clothes he was wearing, his posture, the way he moved. Everything about him was unmistakably my father. Yet at the same time, he didn't look completely solid. The best way I've ever been able to describe it is that he looked like he was made of fog. Not transparent exactly, not ghostly in the way movies portray spirits, just hazy. Gray, almost as though someone had created a perfect image of him out of mist. Despite that hazy appearance, his outline remained incredibly clear. Every edge was distinct, every movement was natural. Nothing about it seemed distorted or dreamlike. In fact, what made the experience so unsettling was how real it felt. I watched as he walked slowly across the room. He didn't say a word. There was absolutely no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of clothes. Nothing. The silence felt complete. Yet his movements appeared completely normal. The first thing he did was approach my mother. He leaned down and wrapped his arms around her. The gesture felt familiar, comforting, exactly the kind of thing he would have done in real life. Then he stepped away from her and moved toward where my girlfriend and I were sitting. At that point, I remember feeling strangely calm. I wasn't frightened. I wasn't panicking. If anything, I felt overwhelmed by a sense of peace. My father stopped between us. He placed one hand on my girlfriend's shoulder. Then he wrapped his other arm around me. And that's when something happened that I've never forgotten. I felt it. Not emotionally. Physically, the sensation wasn't strong enough to be described as pressure, but it was unmistakable. A faint tingling, almost like static electricity. a light buzzing sensation exactly where he appeared to be touching me. The feeling traveled across my shoulder and down my arm. I remember being completely stunned, because up until that moment, I could still tell myself I was simply seeing something unusual. Maybe stress, maybe exhaustion, maybe grief, but feeling something made it harder to dismiss. As the experience unfolded, I found myself doing something strange. I started narrating everything I was seeing, almost as if I needed confirmation that it was happening. I described his movements. I described where he was standing. I described what he was doing. I told my mother and girlfriend exactly what I was witnessing in real time. I remember saying things like, "He's here. He's hugging Mom. Now he's standing next to us. He's touching my shoulder." The entire time, they simply stared at me. Neither of them could see anything. From their perspective, I was sitting at the dinner table describing an invisible person moving around the room. The expressions on their faces said everything. Concern, confusion, uncertainty, the kind of look people give you when they aren't sure whether to take you seriously. Looking back, I don't blame them. If our positions had been reversed, I probably would have reacted the same way. The experience lasted only a short time, maybe a minute, maybe less. It's difficult to judge. Time felt strange during the encounter. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. No dramatic disappearance, no flash, no fading away. One moment he was there, the next moment he wasn't. The room looked completely normal again. The doorway was empty, the house was quiet, and all that remained was the memory of what I had seen. For a long time afterward, I questioned myself. I still do. Was it grief? Stress? Exhaustion? A waking dream brought on by emotional trauma? Those explanations make sense. In fact, they're probably the most logical possibilities. The human mind is capable of extraordinary things, especially during periods of intense emotional distress. I understand that. I've considered every rational explanation I can think of. And yet, one detail always stays with me. The feeling, that faint static sensation where his arm appeared to wrap around me, the tingling on my shoulder, the unmistakable sense of physical contact. It's the one part of the experience I've never been able to fully explain. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable answer. Maybe there isn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that during one of the hardest periods of my life, when my family was facing the reality of losing someone we loved, I experienced something that felt profoundly real. Whether it was my mind searching for comfort, a vivid stress-induced experience, or something else entirely, I can't say. But for a brief moment, sitting around a dinner table at 1:30 in the morning, it felt as though my father had come home. He didn't speak. He didn't offer advice. He didn't explain anything. He simply walked into the room, embraced the people he loved, and stood beside us. And even now, years later, that's exactly how I remember it. One of the strangest and most terrifying experiences of my life happened when I was about 8 years old. Even now, decades later, I remember it with incredible clarity. What makes it so unsettling is that, for a long time, nobody believed me when I tried to explain it. And honestly, if someone told me the same story, I might have trouble believing it too. The reason is simple. For what felt like 2 full days, I lived through my mother's death, except none of it actually happened. My mother is alive and well today. Everything I'm about to describe took place inside a dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like reality. Complete reality. The experience began with my mother becoming seriously ill. In the dream, I remember adults speaking in hushed voices and exchanging worried looks. As a child, I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew something was terribly wrong. The atmosphere around our family changed. Everything felt heavier. sadder, more serious. Eventually, my mother was admitted to the hospital. I can still picture parts of it. The long hallways, the sterile smell, the sound of people speaking quietly, the feeling that everyone was trying to stay strong while silently preparing for the worst. At some point, my father sat down with my sister and me. I remember him looking exhausted, broken, the kind of expression you never want to see on a parent's face. He explained that my mother's illness had been going on for a long time. To us, it felt sudden, but according to him, she had been suffering for much longer than we realized. As a child in the dream, I struggled to understand what that meant. I only knew that everyone around me was hurting. The next part is burned into my memory. I remember seeing my mother lying in a hospital bed. Family members had gathered around her. Aunts, uncles, relatives, people were coming and going, saying goodbye. The room felt crowded, yet strangely quiet. Everyone seemed to understand something that I was still trying to comprehend. Then hospital staff arrived, and they took her away. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. I remember the feeling of helplessness, the feeling that everything was happening too fast, the feeling that I wanted someone to tell me it wasn't real. But nobody did. The dream continued, hour after hour, scene after scene. There were no strange transitions, no dreamlike jumps. Everything unfolded naturally, exactly the way real life would. I remember changing into formal clothes. I remember preparing for church. I remember people crying. I remember standing beside my mother's body. I remember the overwhelming sadness that seemed to surround everyone. The details felt endless, specific, real. That was what made the experience so convincing. Dreams are usually fragmented, random, confusing. This wasn't. This felt like living through actual events. At some point during the night, one of my uncles gathered all the children together. He took my sister, me, and several cousins away so we could sleep. Even in the dream, I remember feeling exhausted. The emotional weight of everything had drained me. The next day was the funeral, and I remember every part of it. The church service, the flowers, the people dressed in black, the faces of family members, the sadness, the silence. I remember standing there as people spoke about my mother. I remember struggling to accept what was happening. Afterward, everyone traveled to the cemetery. The burial felt just as real as everything else. The sunlight, the sound of people talking quietly, the sight of relatives gathered together, the feeling of finality. Even now, I can still picture parts of it. As a child, I truly believed my mother was gone. I experienced the grief completely, the fear, the confusion, the loneliness. All of it felt genuine. When the ceremony ended, family members slowly began leaving. One by one, cars pulled away. Eventually, only my father, my sister, and I remained at home. The house felt empty, not physically empty, emotionally empty. The silence was overwhelming. Nobody seemed capable of speaking. The grief was too large, too heavy, too painful. I remember wandering through the house feeling completely lost. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to process what had happened. At some point, I changed into my pajamas. I decided to lie down for a while. Not because I was tired, because I was emotionally exhausted. I climbed into bed and closed my eyes. Then everything changed. The next morning I woke up. At first, I didn't know anything was different. I simply opened my eyes and lay there. Then the memories came flooding back. My mother had died. The hospital, the funeral, the cemetery, the endless sadness. Every detail returned instantly, and I began crying. Hard, the pain felt fresh, raw, real. I remember lying there in bed, overwhelmed by grief. Then I heard something. The bedroom door opening. I looked up, and there was my mother, standing in the doorway, completely alive, completely healthy, smiling, coming to wake me up for breakfast. For several seconds, my brain simply stopped working. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. It felt impossible. I had just spent what felt like 2 entire days grieving her death. I had watched her die, attended her funeral, visited her grave. How could she be standing there? The confusion was overwhelming. I remember staring at her in complete shock. Then I did the only thing that made sense. I ran to her. I hugged her as tightly as I could. I remember feeling relief unlike anything I've experienced before or since. The kind of relief that makes your entire body feel lighter. The kind of relief that comes after believing you've lost someone forever. Eventually, reality returned. I realized that none of it had happened. My mother wasn't dead. She had never been sick. There had been no hospital, no funeral, no cemetery. It had all been a dream. But even now, that's the part that doesn't make sense to me, because it never felt like a dream. I've had thousands of dreams in my life. Most of them disappeared within minutes of waking up. Others became fuzzy memories. This was different. This dream had continuity, a timeline, events that unfolded logically, emotions that felt authentic. Most importantly, it felt long. Not dream long, lifelong. As though I had actually lived through 2 full days in another reality. When I tried to explain it to people, nobody really understood. Most assumed I was exaggerating. Others thought I was simply remembering a particularly vivid nightmare. But that description never felt accurate. This wasn't just a nightmare. It felt like an entire experience, a complete chapter of life that somehow happened while I slept. Today, decades later, I can still recall specific details from those dream days. The hospital room, the church, the cemetery, the empty house afterward, the grief, and most of all, the overwhelming relief of seeing my mother alive when I woke up. My mother is still here today, healthy, living her life. And every time I think back to that experience, I feel grateful all over again. I still can't explain how a dream could feel so real. I still can't explain how it seemed to last so long. Maybe the human mind is capable of creating experiences far more vivid than we realize. Maybe dreams can sometimes feel indistinguishable from reality. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that for 2 unforgettable days inside a dream, I lived through losing my mother. And when I woke up and saw her standing in my doorway, it felt like I had been given the greatest gift imaginable, a second chance to have her in my life. Even now, more than 30 years later, I remember every moment. One of the strangest things I've ever experienced happened when my oldest daughter was still a baby. At the time, she wasn't even a year old. Like many babies her age, she occasionally had nights where she simply refused to settle down. Most evenings followed the same routine. We'd get her ready for bed, put her down, and eventually she'd drift off to sleep. But every now and then, something would disrupt that routine. One particular night stands out in my memory more than any other. It was late, and my daughter had decided that sleep was not part of her plans. No matter what I tried, she wouldn't settle. She was cranky, overtired, and clearly unhappy about something. I'd rock her, walk around with her, sing to her, and try every trick I knew. But nothing seemed to work. Eventually, I gave up on getting her back to sleep immediately and decided to take her downstairs for a little while. Sometimes a change of scenery helped. The house was quiet. The lights were dim. Everyone else was asleep. I carried her down to the living room and sat on the sofa. She was sitting on my lap facing me while I faced the television and the rest of the room. Behind me was the staircase leading up to the second floor. I remember trying to keep her distracted, talking softly, making silly faces, anything that might calm her down enough to relax. But she wasn't interested. She continued fussing and crying. Nothing seemed to improve her mood. As any parent knows, there are moments when a tired baby can seem determined to stay upset no matter what you do. This was one of those moments. Then, something changed. Instantly, 1 second she was crying. The next second, she stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. Completely, her expression transformed so quickly that it caught my attention immediately. The tears disappeared. The frustration vanished, and in its place appeared the biggest smile. A genuine smile. The kind of smile babies reserve for someone they recognize and genuinely like. At first, I felt relieved. Finally, something had distracted her. Then she looked past me, directly over my shoulder, toward the staircase, and happily said, "Hi." At that age, her vocabulary was still extremely limited, but hi was one of the words she used regularly. She was also an incredibly social baby. If a stranger walked into a room, she'd smile. If a family member appeared unexpectedly, she'd wave. If she saw someone she liked, she'd greet them immediately. So nothing about her reaction seemed unusual. At least, not at first. My immediate assumption was that my husband had come downstairs. It made perfect sense. Maybe the crying had woken him up. Maybe he had come to check on us. Without even turning around, I smiled and said something like, "Well, look who's here." But my daughter wasn't just saying hello. She was reacting, actively interacting with someone. She began waving her little hands excitedly, laughing, giggling, making the happy sounds she usually made when playing with people she loved. The more she reacted, the more convinced I became that my husband was standing behind me. Finally, I turned around. Nobody was there. The staircase was empty. The hallway was empty. The living room was empty. There wasn't another person anywhere in sight. For a second, I simply stared. Then I looked back at my daughter. She was still focused on the exact same spot, still smiling, still waving, still giggling, as if someone was standing right there entertaining her. I remember feeling a small chill run through me. Not overwhelming fear, just that strange feeling you get when something doesn't make sense. I glanced around the room again. Nothing, no movement, no shadows, no explanation. Yet my daughter continued behaving exactly as if she were interacting with another person. What made it particularly unsettling was how natural her behavior seemed. She wasn't staring blankly into space. She wasn't acting confused. She was reacting to something, following something with her eyes, watching something move. Every few seconds she'd smile wider or giggle as though responding to a silent joke. The entire interaction felt completely normal from her perspective, only there was nobody there. I remember trying to rationalize it. Maybe she was looking at a reflection. Maybe she noticed something on the wall. Maybe she was simply distracted by a light source or a shadow. Babies often focus on things adults overlook. That explanation should have been enough. But for some reason, it wasn't. The feeling stayed with me, partly because of how suddenly her mood changed. One moment she was miserable. The next moment she was delighted, and whatever had captured her attention appeared to be standing directly behind me. Eventually, the moment passed. She stopped waving. Her attention shifted elsewhere. Within a few minutes, she seemed calm enough to go back upstairs. Later, when my husband woke up, I asked if he had come downstairs during the night. He looked confused. He hadn't. In fact, he had been asleep the entire time. That was the moment the experience became genuinely strange, because the explanation I'd been relying on disappeared completely. Whoever or whatever my daughter had greeted wasn't him. To this day, I don't claim to know what happened. There are plenty of logical explanations. Babies notice things adults don't. Their imaginations work differently. They react to lights, shadows, sounds, and visual patterns in ways that can seem mysterious. I understand all of that. And honestly, that's probably the correct explanation. But even now, years later, I still remember the way she looked over my shoulder, the way her crying stopped instantly, the excitement in her voice when she said hi, the way she laughed and waved at an apparently empty staircase. Most of all, I remember turning around expecting to see my husband standing there, and finding absolutely nobody. It wasn't the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, but it remains one of the few moments in my life that I still can't fully explain. And every time I think about it, I get the same small chill I felt that night sitting alone on the sofa, while my baby happily greeted someone I couldn't see. I grew up in a very rural part of Maine, the kind of place where the roads stretched through endless woods and you could walk for miles at night without seeing another person. Back then, when I was in high school, I had a routine that probably wasn't very smart, but it felt worth it at the time. I had a girlfriend who lived a little less than a mile from my grandmother's house. Since neither of us had a driver's license yet, and our families definitely wouldn't have approved of our late-night visits, I got into the habit of sneaking out after everyone had gone to sleep. I'd slip quietly out of my grandmother's house, run down the dark country roads to my girlfriend's place, meet up with her, and then we'd head back to my grandmother's house for a few hours before I walked her home again before sunrise. It became a regular thing. One detail is important for this story. My girlfriend was blind. Because of that, whenever we traveled anywhere together, we held hands and ran side by side. She relied heavily on her hearing, and over time I learned to trust her ears more than my own. In many ways, she noticed things long before I ever did. One particular night started like every other. I slipped out after midnight and headed toward her house. The night was unusually quiet. No wind. No traffic, just the sounds of insects and distant wildlife. About halfway there, I noticed something strange. Along one side of the road was a patch of tall grass. Not ordinary grass. This stuff was at least 2 feet high. Normally, it stood upright in thick clumps along the roadside, but tonight a large section of it had been flattened. Not simply bent over. Flattened, pressed down in a path that disappeared into the darkness beyond the road. I slowed down to get a better look. The grass appeared slick, wet, and in the moonlight it looked dark. Very dark. Dark enough that my immediate thought was blood. A lot of blood. I stood there for a moment staring at it. My first assumption was that a coyote or some other predator had dragged an animal into the woods. That explanation made sense. The area was full of wildlife. Still, something about it bothered me. I couldn't explain why. There was just a feeling. A quiet warning in the back of my mind telling me something wasn't right. Eventually, I shook it off and continued to my girlfriend's house. An hour or so later, we were heading back toward my grandmother's place. As always, we were holding hands and jogging down the empty road. The woods stretched endlessly on both sides. No houses, no streetlights, nothing but darkness. We were talking quietly when my girlfriend suddenly stopped. Hard, so abruptly that she nearly pulled me off balance. "What?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. Listening, then she said something that immediately made my stomach drop. "Stop." Her voice sounded serious. I stopped moving. "What is it?" For several seconds she remained completely still. Then she spoke. "Someone's humming." The words hit me like a punch. I listened carefully. At first I couldn't hear anything. The night seemed completely silent. But my girlfriend insisted. "No," she said. "Someone is definitely humming." Then she pointed. Off to our left. Almost exactly where I had seen the flattened grass earlier. A cold feeling crept through me. The road was pitch black. There were no houses nearby, no lights, no cars, no reason for anyone to be standing out there in the woods in the middle of the night, especially not humming. I stood there straining my ears, trying to hear whatever she was hearing, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. She kept insisting. I swear someone is humming. The longer we stood there, the more uncomfortable I became. Every instinct in my body told me we shouldn't be there. Maybe 30 seconds passed, maybe less. Eventually, I grabbed her hand tighter and said the only thing that felt reasonable. We need to go. Then we started running again. Fast, neither of us spoke much after that. I just wanted to get her home. The entire way, I felt as though something was watching us from the darkness. When we finally reached her house, I felt a wave of relief. She went inside, and before closing the door, she made me promise to text her when I got back home safely. I agreed. Then I turned around and realized I had to make the entire trip back alone. Suddenly the road felt very different. The woods felt larger, darker. The silence felt heavier. I took a deep breath and started running. At the time, I was an all-state runner. I was in the best shape of my life. Running a mile wasn't difficult. I trained constantly. Distance never bothered me. But that night was different. Because I wasn't running for exercise. I was running because I was scared. The road stretched ahead of me in darkness. Every step brought me closer to the section where the grass had been flattened. Closer to whatever my girlfriend had heard. Closer to whatever had been humming. As I approached the area, I could feel my pulse accelerating. I kept telling myself it was probably an animal. A coyote, a deer, anything, something normal, something explainable. Then I saw them. 2 tiny red points glowing in the darkness. At first they didn't register as eyes. They were simply 2 red dots suspended just off the side of the road. Watching, motionless, my entire body locked up. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around. Instead, I did the opposite. I accelerated. I started running harder than I ever had in my life. My plan was simple. Get past whatever it was as quickly as possible. Don't stop. Don't look too closely. Just keep moving. As I got closer, the red points remained fixed on me. Watching, waiting, the distance between us shrank. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. Then I heard it. The humming. Exactly as my girlfriend had described. A soft, low humming sound coming from the darkness. The sound froze my blood, and then I finally saw the thing attached to the eyes. To this day, I struggle to explain what I saw. The figure was sitting on the ground, almost like a panda bear, hunched forward, balanced on its backside, perfectly still. At first, I couldn't make sense of its shape. Then my eyes adjusted, and what I saw made everything worse. The figure looked like a little girl, not a normal little girl. A grotesque imitation of one, maybe 100 pounds, thin, small, human-shaped. As I ran past, its head slowly turned toward me. The movement was smooth, deliberate, almost curious. And then I saw its face, the glowing red eyes, and a grin, a horrible grin. The kind of smile that instantly triggers fear before your brain even understands why. There was something profoundly wrong about it. Every detail felt wrong. Every instinct told me that whatever I was looking at was not something I wanted to understand. I didn't stop. I didn't scream. I didn't even fully process what I'd seen. I just ran. Harder than I had ever run before. To this day, I genuinely believe I ran the final half mile in about 2 minutes. Adrenaline carried me the entire way. I burst through the door of my grandmother's house shaking so badly I could barely stand. My heart felt like it was trying to break through my chest. I collapsed in the mudroom. At some point, my grandmother found me sitting there, crying, shaking, completely terrified. Naturally, she wanted to know what had happened. I couldn't exactly tell her the truth, so I made up some story about going for a midnight run, because I couldn't sleep, and seeing something horrible in the woods. She listened patiently. Then she gave the most practical answer imaginable. It was probably a coyote. Then she sent me to bed. The next morning, we drove back to the area. Part of me hoped I had imagined everything. That daylight would reveal some simple explanation. But when we reached the spot, the grass was still there. Flattened, slick, and dark. Exactly as I remembered it. We never found an explanation. Years have passed since then. I don't believe in monsters. I don't believe in paranormal creatures lurking in the woods. I prefer logical explanations, rational explanations. But every now and then, usually in the middle of the night, I wake up drenched in sweat after dreaming about that road, about the humming, about the glowing red eyes, about that impossible grin turning toward me from the darkness. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for what I saw. Maybe there still is. But whatever was sitting beside that road that night, it was unlike anything I've ever encountered before or since. And even now, all these years later, thinking about it still makes my skin crawl. I have two experiences that have stayed with me for most of my life. One left me questioning what I saw for decades. The other was one of the most incredible natural phenomena I've ever witnessed. Oddly enough, both happened long before the internet made it easy to compare experiences with other people. The first happened when I was around 12 years old, in the mid-1990s. At the time, my best friend and I spent a lot of time hanging around our church. The building had a basement that doubled as a daycare during the week. It wasn't unusual for us to explore the lower level when nobody else was around. One afternoon, we were playing downstairs in the daycare area. The basement had several rooms branching off from a larger central space. One of those rooms was a nursery. The nursery had a window facing the main room and two separate entrance doors leading into it. The layout is important because there was no realistic way for someone to enter or leave the nursery without passing directly by us. We would have seen them. My friend and I were hanging out in the main room when something caught my eye. Movement. I glanced toward the nursery window. A man walked past. At least, that's what it looked like. He was only visible for a moment, but one detail immediately stood out. He was wearing a hat. Not a baseball cap. Not a modern hat. The silhouette looked more like an old-fashioned brimmed hat. The kind of shape that's instantly recognizable even when you can't make out facial details. For a second, I wasn't sure if I'd actually seen what I thought I saw. Then I turned to my friend and asked the obvious question. "Did you see that?" Without hesitation, he answered. "The man in the hat?" The moment he said that, every hair on my arm stood up, because he had seen exactly what I had seen. Not just movement, not just a shadow. The same figure, the same hat, the same brief glimpse. At first, we assumed somebody was messing with us. That seemed like the only reasonable explanation. Maybe an adult had wandered downstairs, maybe someone was trying to scare us. Whatever the case, we decided we were going to catch them. The nursery had two entrances. Without saying much, we immediately split up. I moved toward one door. My friend headed for the other. The plan was simple. If someone was hiding inside the room, they wouldn't be able to escape without one of us seeing them. We counted silently and pushed through the doors at almost the same time. The room was empty, completely empty. No person, no hiding place, no movement, nothing. I remember looking around in disbelief. The nursery wasn't large enough for someone to disappear. There was nowhere to go, no back exit. No hidden doorway, no open window, nothing. Yet the figure we'd both seen moments earlier was gone. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then we did what two kids in the 1990s would naturally do when confronted with something they couldn't explain. We got out of there as fast as possible. Neither of us wanted to spend another second in that basement. For years, The experience remained one of those strange childhood mysteries. Every once in a while, we'd bring it up and wonder what we'd actually seen. Neither of us had an answer. Then, around 3 or 4 years ago, something happened that completely caught me off guard. I was watching videos online when I stumbled across a discussion about something called the Hat Man. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Then, people started describing their experiences. The silhouette, the hat, the unmistakable appearance. As I listened, I felt a chill run down my spine. The descriptions sounded remarkably familiar. Far too familiar. Immediately, I thought about that afternoon in the church basement. I ended up texting my childhood friend. I told him what I'd discovered and asked if he remembered. Of course he remembered. The moment I mentioned it, he knew exactly what I was talking about. And just like me, he was completely shocked to learn that other people claimed to have experienced something similar. To this day, I don't know what we saw. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something else entirely. But after all these years, it's still one of the strangest experiences of my life. The second experience is much easier to explain, at least scientifically, but in many ways it was even more incredible. This happened in the late 1990s. I was sitting in a car with my mom and my cousin during a thunderstorm. We were stopped at a red light at the intersection of Troy Avenue and Lyndhurst Drive. Rain was falling. Thunder echoed in the distance. The sky was dark and heavy with storm clouds. It was the kind of weather that naturally grabs your attention. As we sat waiting for the light to change, something appeared in the sky. At first I thought it was lightning, but it wasn't. It was a glowing orb, a huge orb, bright, pulsating, almost alive looking. The object seemed to hover in the air for a moment before beginning a slow descent toward the ground. Nobody in the car said a word. We were all too busy staring. The orb moved with an eerie smoothness, not falling, not streaking through the sky, descending, as though it had a destination. I remember feeling completely mesmerized. None of us had ever seen anything remotely like it. The glowing sphere continued downward until it approached a tree on the opposite side of the intersection. For a brief moment, it seemed to hover near the branches. Then it touched the tree. The instant it made contact, everything exploded. A deafening blast echoed across the intersection. The tree literally burst apart. Pieces of wood flew in multiple directions. The force of the explosion was incredible. Within seconds, the trunk was on fire. I can still remember staring through the windshield in complete disbelief. The entire event lasted only moments, but it felt unforgettable. Even as a kid, I knew I had witnessed something extraordinarily rare. Later, I learned about a phenomenon known as ball lightning. Many people have heard stories about it. Very few people ever actually see it. At the time, however, none of us knew what it was. We only knew we had witnessed a glowing sphere descend from the sky and explode a tree. More than 20 years later, it's still one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. What's interesting is that while I've read accounts of ball lightning and watched documentaries about it, I've never seen a video that truly captures what I witnessed that day. Most recordings look different. Smaller, less dramatic, less vivid. Nothing I've seen since has quite matched that memory. Of all the unusual things I've encountered in my life, those two experiences stand out the most. One remains a mystery. The other was likely an incredibly rare natural event, but both left a lasting impression. One made me question what I saw. The other made me appreciate how astonishing the natural world can be. And decades later, I still remember both of them as clearly as if they happened yesterday. One of the strangest experiences of my childhood happened when I was around 7 years old. Even now, many years later, I still don't know exactly what happened that night. I've spent a lot of time trying to come up with logical explanations. I've revisited the memory countless times, examining every detail and questioning whether I remembered it correctly. But no matter how much I analyze it, one part of the experience still refuses to make sense. Like many children, I was terrified of the dark. Nighttime always felt different to me. The moment the lights went out, familiar objects would transform into unfamiliar shapes. Shadows seemed larger than they should be. Ordinary sounds suddenly felt threatening. Every dark corner of the room seemed capable of hiding something. Most nights, I eventually convinced myself everything was fine and managed to fall asleep. This particular night was different. I remember lying awake in bed, staring into the darkness. The house was quiet. My parents were asleep. The only sounds were the faint creaks and settling noises that every house makes at night. I was already nervous before anything unusual happened. At some point, while staring across the room, I noticed movement on the wall. At first, I assumed it was my imagination. That wasn't unusual. When you're a frightened child lying in the dark, it's easy to mistake shadows for something more. But this wasn't like that. The shapes were moving, not subtly, not in a way that could easily be dismissed. They seemed to shift and flow across the wall in front of me. The movement was obvious, deliberate, almost impossible to ignore. I remember staring at them in confusion, trying to figure out what was causing it. The shapes didn't resemble anything familiar. They weren't reflections from passing headlights. They weren't tree branches moving outside a window. At least, not that I could tell. They simply continued changing and shifting in ways that felt wrong. The longer I watched, the more frightened I became. Every instinct told me to stop looking. Eventually, fear won. I pulled my blanket closer and buried my face into my pillow. I wanted to block everything out. I didn't want to see the wall anymore. I didn't want to see the shapes. I just wanted the feeling to go away. Then, something happened that I have never been able to explain. The moment my face pressed into the pillow, words appeared in front of my vision. Not written on the wall. Not written on the pillow. They seemed to exist directly in front of me, as though they were somehow projected into my sight. I could read them clearly. The sentence said, "If you are afraid of your sight, may I ask, why do you stare?" I still remember the exact wording. Word for word, that's part of what has always bothered me. Most childhood memories fade, details disappear, conversations become fuzzy, yet somehow those words remained perfectly preserved in my mind. The instant I read them, pure terror took over. I didn't stop to think. I didn't try to understand. I reacted. I screamed, loudly, loud enough to wake my parents. Within moments, I heard footsteps rushing down the hallway. My bedroom door flew open. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, instantly making everything feel less threatening. My father stood in the doorway asking what was wrong. I remember desperately trying to explain what I had seen. The moving shapes, the words, the feeling that something impossible had just happened. To his credit, he didn't dismiss me. My parents could tell I was genuinely terrified. Whatever had happened, I clearly believed it was real. Rather than sending me back to bed, they let me sleep in their room for the rest of the night. Normally, that would have made me feel safe immediately. But that night, the fear lingered. I remember lying awake in my parents' bed for what felt like hours. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every small light source seemed strange. Every movement caught my attention. I kept thinking I was seeing things. Tiny flashes, shapes, patterns. At the time, it felt like the experience was continuing. Looking back as an adult, I can explain most of those later moments. When you're frightened, exhausted, and staring into darkness, your brain starts interpreting ordinary visual effects in unusual ways. Light spots, after images, shadows, the natural tricks that human vision plays in low light conditions. Most of that makes sense to me now. What doesn't make sense is the beginning. The shapes, and especially the text. That's the part I've never been able to fully reconcile. Over the years, I've considered countless explanations. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I was caught in that strange state between sleep and wakefulness where dreams can bleed into reality. Maybe I experienced a vivid hypnagogic hallucination without realizing it. Maybe my brain briefly generated an image and I interpreted it as something external. Those explanations are all possible. In fact, they're probably the most likely answers. The human mind is capable of extraordinary things, especially when a child is frightened and half asleep. But the reason the memory stayed with me for so long is because it never felt like a dream. Dreams usually have a certain quality to them. Even vivid dreams often feel strange when you look back on them. This didn't, at least not in my memory. It felt like I was fully awake, fully aware, lying in my room watching something happen. That certainty remained with me for years. For the longest time, I genuinely believed the event had happened exactly as I remembered it. Only as I got older did I begin questioning it. Only as I learned more about sleep, perception, and memory did I start considering alternative explanations. Even now, though, there remains a small part of me that still feels the same unease I felt as a child. Not because I believe something supernatural visited me. Not because I think the message came from some mysterious entity, but because the experience felt so real. And because, after all these years, I still remember those words with absolute clarity. If you are afraid of your sight, may I ask, why do you stare? It's such an oddly specific sentence, such a strange thing for a frightened 7-year-old to imagine. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a trick of a tired mind. Maybe it was nothing more than a brief overlap between sleep and wakefulness. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the memory has stayed with me for decades. And even now, when I think back to that dark bedroom and those impossible words hanging in front of my vision, I feel the same chill I felt that night. Not because I know what happened, but because I still don't. 15. Here's the rewritten version in smooth, natural English, with stronger suspense, emotional pacing, and a cinematic horror story feel while staying faithful to the original experience. When I was a kid, I had a recurring nightmare that haunted me for years. I'm 35 now, and even after all this time, I can still picture it with incredible clarity. The thing chasing me wasn't a ghost, a monster under the bed, or some shadowy figure lurking in the dark. It was a minotaur. Not the mythical creature exactly as it's depicted in books, but something my young mind interpreted as a minotaur. Huge, powerful, human-shaped, but wrong. It had the head of a bull, massive horns, and a presence that radiated pure dread. What made the nightmares so disturbing wasn't just the creature itself, it was the way it got closer. Every single time. The dreams didn't repeat. They progressed, like chapters in a story. The first time I remember seeing it, it wasn't even on our property. I was standing near a window looking outside, and there it was, far away, peering around my neighbor's fence. I can still picture the image, just its head and part of its shoulder visible, as it looked toward my house, toward me. Even though it wasn't close, I knew somehow that it was there for me. The dream ended before anything else happened. For a while, that was all I remembered. Then the next nightmare came. This time, the minotaur wasn't at the neighbor's fence anymore. It had moved. Now it was standing in our backyard. Closer, close enough that I could make out more details. Its size, its shape, the way it stared. Again, I woke up terrified. Weeks later, another dream. The Minotaur had moved again. Now it was standing on the back deck, no longer watching from a distance, no longer separated by a yard. It had reached the house. I remember waking up sweating and struggling to shake the feeling that it was somehow getting closer each time. Then came another dream. The creature was inside, standing in the mudroom. The room felt dark and cramped, and there it was, just standing there, waiting. Every nightmare followed the same pattern. The creature never ran, never attacked, never spoke. It simply moved closer. And somehow, that made it far worse. The next dream placed it in the kitchen. The one after that in the hallway. Each time I woke up terrified. Each time the Minotaur was one room closer to my bedroom. As a child, I began dreading sleep, because I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew where the story was heading. The monster was coming, and eventually it would reach me. The final dream I remembered for most of my life happened when the Minotaur finally reached my bedroom. I can still see the image clearly. I was lying in bed, frozen, unable to move. The doorway was open, and there it stood, its enormous hands gripping either side of the doorframe, its massive body filling the entrance, just staring at me, watching. The sense of fear was overwhelming. I remember waking up after that one convinced that it was the end. For years, that remained my last memory of the nightmare. The story seemed complete. The creature had reached my room, and strangely enough, I never had another dream about it. At least, that's what I believed. About 10 years ago, I started thinking about those nightmares again. Eventually, during a conversation with my mother, I mentioned them. I laughed about how vividly I still remembered that final image. The Minotaur standing in my doorway, watching me from the darkness. I told her that was the last dream in the series. Then, something unexpected happened. My mother hesitated, not for a second, for several seconds. The kind of pause that immediately makes you realize there's more to the story. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me something I'd never heard before. According to her, it didn't end with the doorway. There was another nightmare. One final nightmare. And apparently, it was the worst one of all. My mother explained that every time I had one of those dreams, I would scream in my sleep. Not whimper, not cry. Scream. The screams were intense enough that she would rush into my room to wake me. The strange thing was that I was often difficult to wake up. Sometimes she had to shake me repeatedly before I came out of it. I had no memory of any of that. As far as I knew, I simply had bad dreams and woke up frightened. But from her perspective, something much more dramatic was happening. Then she told me about the final nightmare, the one I don't remember. She said that one night she heard me screaming louder than ever before. She rushed into my room and found me thrashing around in bed, calling out. Terrified, she tried waking me up, but she couldn't. Not immediately. According to her, I kept yelling the same thing over and over. The Minotaur is climbing the ladder. At the time, I slept in a bunk bed, and apparently, in the nightmare, the creature had finally entered my room, not standing in the doorway anymore, not watching from a distance, actually climbing toward me, one rung at a time, coming up the ladder, coming to where I was sleeping. My mother said she desperately tried to wake me. Eventually, she succeeded, but I have absolutely no memory of that dream. None. It's gone. Completely absent from my recollection. If she had never mentioned it, I would still believe the doorway was the final chapter. Instead, the story apparently ended with the creature reaching my bed. And then something even stranger happened. The nightmares stopped. Completely. No final confrontation. No resolution. No explanation. Just silence. After years of recurring dreams, they vanished overnight and never returned. Not once. 25 years have passed since then. I've had countless dreams, countless nightmares, but never another dream about the Minotaur, never another glimpse of it, never another chapter in that strange childhood story. Sometimes I wonder why that particular nightmare stayed with me for so long. Maybe it was because of how vivid it felt. Maybe it was because the dreams seemed connected. Or maybe it was because, even as a child, I sensed there was something uniquely unsettling about a threat that moved slowly, relentlessly, one step closer every time. The thing that still gives me chills isn't the image of the creature itself. It's the progression, the feeling that every dream was moving toward an inevitable conclusion. The fence, the backyard, the deck, the mudroom, the kitchen, the hallway, the doorway, and finally, according to my mother, the ladder. One room at a time, one nightmare at a time, getting closer and closer until there was nowhere left for it to go. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it disappeared forever. At least, from my dreams. The memory never did.